100 Apache warriors stood in a silent line, their shadows stretching across the cracked earth of the valley. Their bows were raised, but not a single arrow flew. Jack Harrow lay in the dirt, blood pooling under him, his eyes fixed on the fading sky. This was not how it was supposed to end, not for a man like Jack, who had nothing left but his name and a choice that changed everything. To understand why those warriors were there, why Jack was bleeding out, you have to go back 2 days, to the moment it all began. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps keep stories like this alive. Jack Harrow was 42, a cowboy with a limp and a cough that rattled his chest. He was not the man he used to be. The ranch boss, a grizzled old cuss named Cutler, had fired him that morning, said Jack was too slow, too broken to keep up with the young hands who could ride all day and not complain. All Jack had left was Dust, his scrawny horse, who was more bone than muscle but loyal in a way that made Jack's heart ache. Dust was his only friend, the one thing he could count on in a world that kept taking. Jack was riding Dust through a dry valley, the sun scorching his neck, when he saw her. A woman, crumpled in the sand, her buckskin dress dark with blood, her hair was black, matted, and her eyes were half open, like she was clinging to life by a thread. Jack slid off Dust and knelt beside her. Her name, he would learn later, was Ahioka, an Apache woman, maybe 25, maybe less. She had a deep gash across her side, blood seeping into the dirt, her breathing shallow and uneven. Ahioka's eyes flicked to him, and she pulled a knife from her belt, her hand trembling. She shouted something in Apache, her voice weak but fierce. Jack stayed still, his hands up, empty. He did not know her words, but he knew what fear looked like. She thought he was like the others, the men who spat the word savage like it was a curse. Jack could have walked away, could have climbed back on Dust and left her there. Nobody would have cared, not in this town. But Jack was not that kind of man. He looked at Dust, then at Ahioka's pale face. If he gave her his horse, he would lose everything. A cowboy without a horse was a nobody, a ghost. But if he left her to die, he would carry that weight forever. He made his choice. He untied Dust's reins, set his saddlebag with a canteen and a strip of jerky beside her, and led the horse to her side. Then he turned and walked away, the valley's heat swallowing him whole. Ahioka watched him go, her knife still clutched tight. She was shaking, her pride battling her pain. But she pulled herself onto Dust, wincing as she gripped the reins. Before she rode off, she looked back at Jack, his figure small against the horizon. Her eyes held something new, not just gratitude, but trust, the kind that crosses lines drawn in blood. Dust carried Ahioka through the jagged canyons, his hooves steady on the uneven rock, while her blood dripped a faint trail behind them. She leaned forward, whispering words of encouragement in her language, her fingers tangled in his mane as waves of dizziness hit her. The horse did not falter, pushing on as if he understood the urgency, his breaths coming in deep huffs. As the sun dipped lower, Ahioka spotted the smoke from her village fires, and she let out a weak call that echoed off the walls. Warriors rushed out, their faces hardening at the sight of her wound, but softening when they saw the strange horse. Kohana lifted her down, his arms strong, his expression a mix of fury and relief as he barked orders for the healer. The elders gathered, murmuring about the white man's horse, while Ahioka, between gasps, described Jack's act, his empty hands, his silent departure. The camp fell quiet, the fire crackling as they wrapped her side, and Kohana's fist clenched, his eyes narrowing toward the valley. Jack walked for hours, his boots kicking up dust, his throat dry as bone. By morning, he limped into town, his body aching, his heart heavy. The townsfolk saw him and started laughing. A cowboy without a horse? That was a joke they could not let go. They gathered in the street, pointing, calling him a beggar, a fool. What kind of man loses his only horse? One yelled. Another said he was no better than the drunks who slept in the alleys. Jack kept his head down, his jaw tight, and pushed through the crowd. As Jack shuffled past the saloon, a young girl named Sarah, no older than 10, slipped from the crowd and tugged at his sleeve. Her eyes were wide, her braid loose, and she pressed a small apple into his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "My pa says you're no good. "But I saw you help that stray dog last summer," she said, glancing nervously at the jeering men. Jack looked down at the apple, his fingers closing around it, and gave her a small nod before she darted back to her mother. The crowd's laughter drowned out her words, but Jack slipped the apple into his pocket, his steps a little steadier as he moved on. The laughter turned sour when the rumors started. Someone said Jack had sold dust to an Apache. Another swore they saw him hand the horse to a redskin woman. By noon, the story was that Jack was a traitor, working with the Apache to bring trouble to the town. The whispers grew sharp, the townsfolk's eyes cold. Jack felt it, like a storm rolling in, heavy and unstoppable. That afternoon, a group of young cowboys cornered him outside the general store. They were drunk, their faces flushed with whiskey and hate. They shoved Jack to his knees, called him a dog, a sellout to the Apache. One of them, a wiry kid named Tate, spat in Jack's face. The spit hit his cheek, wet and warm, but Jack did not flinch. He stared at the ground, his fists clenched, knowing fighting back would only make it worse. An old miner named Elias, who had shared campfires with Jack years back, pushed through the crowd, his walking stick thumping the ground. He grabbed Tate's arm, yanking him back with surprising force, his voice gravelly as he said, "Enough of this. Jack's no traitor, he's the one who pulled me from that cave-in last winter." The young cowboys turned, their eyes narrowing, and one shoved Elias hard, sending him stumbling into the dirt. Tate laughed, kicking dust at the old man, while the others closed in tighter around Jack. Elias struggled to his feet, his face red, but the crowd jeered him silent, their boots scuffing the ground as they ignored his pleas. Jack glanced at Elias, their eyes meeting for a split second, and Jack gave a slight nod, his lips pressed thin, before turning away. The miner's hands shook as he backed off, the laughter drowning his mutters. Cutler showed up then, his boots heavy on the wooden porch. He loomed over Jack, his shadow blocking the sun. "If the Apache come tomorrow, Harrow," he said, his voice low and mean, "we will hang you first." The crowd roared, their anger feeding off each other. Jack stayed quiet. He got up, wiped the spit from his face, and walked away. That night, he slept in an alley behind the saloon, his back against a wall, his eyes on the stars. He felt something coming, something big, but he could not name it. Jack reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a faded locket, his fingers tracing the engraved initials without looking. He clicked it open, staring at the tiny portrait inside a woman with soft eyes and a smile that once lit his days. His thumb rubbed the glass, smudging it slightly, and he snapped it shut, shoving it back with a sharp exhale. The alley cats scattered as he shifted, his cough echoing off the walls, and he leaned his head back, eyes closing tight against the memories. As the stars blinked above, a stray dog, ribs showing through its patchy fur, slunk into the alley and curled up near Jack's boots. It whimpered softly, nudging his hand, and Jack opened his eyes, his fingers brushing its head gently. He broke off a piece of Sarah's apple from his pocket and held it out, watching the dog eat with careful bites. The small act steadied his breathing, and he leaned back, the dog's warmth against his leg a quiet comfort in the cold night. In the middle of the night, hoofbeats shook the ground. The town woke in a panic, men grabbing rifles, women pulling children inside. From the hills, 100 Apache warriors rode in, their silhouettes dark against the moon. The townsfolk froze, their fingers tight on triggers. This was it. They thought the attack they had always feared, the one they had been waiting for. Sheriff Harlan burst from his office, buckling his gun belt, his deputies scrambling behind him with lanterns swinging. He shouted orders, positioning men behind barrels and wagons, their rifles cocked and aimed at the approaching riders. Women clutched shawls tighter, peeking from windows, while children whimpered, hushed by urgent whispers. Harlan's face glistened with sweat, his hand steady on his revolver as he scanned the line of warriors, counting them under his breath. One deputy fumbled his weapon, dropping it in the dirt, and Harlan hissed a curse, kicking it back to him. The air hummed with tension, the only sound the distant hoofbeats growing louder. But the warriors did not attack. They formed a line at the edge of town, silent, still. Torches flickered in their hands, casting shadows on the ground. From the center of their ranks, Dust stepped forward, his bony frame draped in a red woven blanket, intricate and heavy with meaning. On his back were gifts, beads, furs, a carved wooden bowl, polished to a shine. The townsfolk stared, their mouths open. This was not war. This was something else entirely. A preacher, his coat dusty from a late-night sermon, stepped out from the church, clutching his Bible, his voice trembling as he called for peace. He raised his hands toward the warriors, his eyes pleading, and began reciting a psalm, his words faltering under the crowd's shouts. One man shoved him aside, yelling, "No prayers will save us now." The preacher stumbled, his Bible falling open in the dirt, but he kept chanting, his voice rising, until a woman pulled him back, her face pale with fear. The whispers started again, louder, angrier. "It's a trick," someone shouted. "They are softening us up." The crowd surged, their fear turning to rage. They grabbed Jack from the alley, tied his hands with rough rope, and dragged him to the town square. Cutler was there, his eyes burning. "You brought this on us," he said. "You and your Apache friends." Jack tried to speak, but a fist slammed into his jaw, and he tasted blood. Then Ahioka appeared, walking steady despite her bandaged wound. Beside her was a man, tall and broad, his presence like a mountain. This was Kohana, her brother, the Apache leader. Ahioka stepped forward, her voice clear. She said Jack had saved her life, that he gave up his only horse to keep her alive. Kohana nodded, his eyes sweeping the crowd. He asked for Jack to be freed, his voice calm but firm. A widow named Clara, whose husband had died in a raid years ago, stepped from the crowd, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. She approached Ahioka, her eyes wide, and touched the bandage on Ahioka's side gently, her fingers lingering as if checking for truth. Ahioka did not pull away, meeting Clara's gaze steadily, and Clara's hand trembled, pulling back slowly. The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, but Cutler barked, "Don't listen to her lies." Clara turned, her face pale, and whispered to a neighbor, who nodded hesitantly, the ripple spreading through the group. The townsfolk did not listen. They raised their guns, their voices a tangle of curses and threats. Ahioka's words were swallowed by the noise. The air felt thick, ready to break. Jack, his hands bound, saw the rifles, saw the hatred in the eyes around him. He knew what this could become: blood, fire, a war that would burn everything to ash. He shouted, his voice rough but loud, "If you shoot, you will start a fire you cannot put out." The crowd paused, just for a heartbeat, but it was not enough. Someone threw a rope over a tree branch, a noose at the end. They looped it around Jack's neck, pulling it tight. Ahioka lunged forward, trying to stop them, but a man shoved her down, her body hitting the dirt. Her cry was sharp, cutting through the chaos. Jack's eyes locked on Ahioka as she struggled to rise, dirt smearing her face, and he mouthed a single word, "Go," his expression fierce, brows furrowed. She shook her head, crawling closer, her nails digging into the earth, tears carving clean lines down her cheeks. The rope tightened, and Jack's face reddened, but he held her gaze, unblinking, until she nodded once, her lips quivering. A boy, barely 12, darted from the crowd, clutching a slingshot, his face streaked with dirt and defiance. He aimed at the man holding the rope, his small stone flying true and striking the man's hand, making him curse and loosen his grip for a moment. The crowd gasped, some turning on the boy, but he stood his ground, his slingshot raised, until his mother yanked him back, her voice sharp with panic. Jack's eyes flickered to the boy, a faint smile breaking through his pain, before the rope tightened again. The crowd was screaming now, a wall of sound. Guns clicked, ready to fire. Jack's heart pounded, his vision narrowing. He had one chance, one moment to change this. He twisted against the rope, his boots scraping the ground, and threw himself forward. A gunshot cracked, and pain tore through his chest. He fell, blood soaking his shirt, the world tilting. But then, the warriors moved. 100 bows rose, arrows notched, but instead of firing, they drove the arrows into the earth. It was a gesture, old as their people, a sign of peace. Kohana stepped forward, his voice like thunder. "This man is our brother," he said. "Harm him, and you declare war on us all." A young Apache warrior, barely out of boyhood, broke from the line, his bow dropping as he knelt beside Jack, pressing a cloth to the wound with steady hands. His face was set, jaw clenched, ignoring the townsfolk's stares, while blood stained his fingers. Kohana glanced at him, nodding approval, and the youth whispered something low in Apache, his voice steady despite the chaos. The townsfolk froze. Some dropped their guns, their hands shaking. Others backed away, their faces pale. Jack was fading, his breath shallow, but he heard Kohana's words. Ahioka crawled to him, her hands pressing against his wound, her eyes wet with tears. "You did this," she whispered. "You changed everything." Kohana knelt beside Jack, his hand on Jack's chest. "This man saved my sister," he said to the crowd. "He saved our honor." The townsfolk were silent, their anger crumbling. The men who had spat on Jack, who had called him a traitor, looked away, their heads bowed. The rope was cut, and Jack was lifted, carried to a bed in the saloon. An old woman, her hands gnarled from years of sewing, slipped into the saloon as Jack was laid down, her basket heavy with clean cloth. She pushed past the men, her voice sharp as she ordered them to step back, and began tearing strips to bind Jack's wound, her fingers quick and sure. Her eyes met Ahioka's, and she nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, before turning back to her work, her lips moving in a quiet prayer no one else could hear. Days passed, and Jack drifted in and out of consciousness. His chest burned, but he was alive. Dust stood by his side, his big eyes calm, his loyalty unbroken. Outside, the Apache warriors had not left. They had set up camp around the town, their tents a quiet promise. They were not there to fight. They were there to protect Jack, the man who had given everything for one of their own. The town doctor, a wiry man with spectacles, wiped his brow as he changed Jack's bandages, his hands pausing mid-motion. He shook his head, muttering, "That bullet missed your heart by a hair. It's a miracle you're breathing." Jack grunted, wincing, and the doctor straightened, his eyes wide behind the lenses, before packing his bag with hurried movements, glancing out the window at the Apache camp. Ahioka came every day. She sat by his bed, her voice soft but strong. "If you had not given me dust," she said, "I would not be here. My people would not be here." She paused, her hand on his. "You showed us what a man can be." Jack tried to speak, but his voice was weak. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers. The townsfolk were changing. Some came to apologize, their voices small, their eyes on the floor. Others left gifts: bread, a blanket, a pair of boots. Cutler was gone, vanished into the hills, his name a curse now. The town was quiet, the air heavy with something new, something like understanding. Jack's sacrifice had done more than save Ahioka. It had stopped a war, maybe for good. A blacksmith, his apron still dusted with soot, stood outside the saloon one evening, hammering a horseshoe into a crude plaque with Jack's name scratched across it. He hung it above the saloon door, his hands steady despite the crowd's murmurs, and stepped back, wiping his face with a rag. A few townsfolk stopped, their heads tilting as they read the inscription, their voices hushed as they moved on. But the story was not over. A week later, a new rumor started. Some townsfolk said the Apache were planning to stay, to take the valley for themselves. Fear crept back, slow but steady. Men started carrying rifles again, their eyes darting to the hills. Jack heard the whispers from his bed, his strength returning but his heart heavy. He knew fear could undo everything. One morning, Kohana came to see him. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Your people are afraid again," he said. "They think we want their land." Jack sat up, wincing. "What do you want?" he asked. Kohana looked at him, long and steady. "We want peace," he said. "But peace needs trust." He paused, then added, "You gave us that trust. Now we need your help again." Jack knew what he had to do. He got up, his legs shaky, and walked to the town square. The townsfolk gathered, their faces tense. Jack stood tall, his voice steady despite the pain. "These people are not here to take anything," he said. "They are here because I gave them something, and they gave it back." He pointed to dust, standing nearby, still draped in that red blanket. "They are not your enemy. They are your neighbors." A schoolteacher, her glasses fogged from the heat, gathered her students in the square, her voice firm as she told them to listen to Jack. She held up a chalkboard, scribbling his name and the word peace in large letters, her hands shaking slightly. The children watched, wide-eyed, as she pointed to dust, her voice breaking as she said, "This is what courage looks like." A few townsfolk shifted, their faces softening, while others muttered, unconvinced. The crowd was quiet. Some nodded, others looked away. A few still gripped their guns, but their hands were not as tight. Ahioka stood beside Jack, her eyes proud. Kohana stepped forward, raising his hand. "We will leave this valley," he said. "But we will not forget this man." He looked at Jack. "You are our brother. This land is yours as much as it is ours." The warriors began to pack their camp that day. The townsfolk watched, some in relief, others in shame. Jack stood with Dust, his hand on the horse's neck. Ahioka approached, her steps slow. "You could come with us," she said. "You would be honored." Jack smiled, weak but real. "This is my home," he said, "but I will never forget you." Before mounting her horse, Ahioka pressed a small pouch into Jack's hand, her fingers lingering on his palm. Inside were seeds from sacred plants, tied with a leather cord, and she closed his fist around it, her eyes shining. Jack squeezed the pouch, nodding once, and she turned away, her shoulders straight as she joined the riders. The Apache left at dawn, their horses kicking up dust that lingered in the air. The town was silent, changed. Jack's wound healed slow, but his spirit was strong. Dust stayed by his side, and the townsfolk started treating Jack different. They offered him work, a place to stay. Some called him a hero, though he waved that off. He was just a man who made a choice. Months later, a trader came through town with a story. The Apache had spread word of Jack's deed, calling him the man who gave his horse for peace. Other tribes had heard. And the valley was quieter now, the raids fewer. Jack listened, his eyes on the horizon. He did not say much, but he felt it, the weight of a world shifted by one small act. One morning, Jack woke to find Dust waiting outside, his eyes bright. Beside him was a new saddle, left by someone in the night, carved with Apache symbols. Jack ran his hand over it, his throat tight. He climbed onto Dust, his body still sore, and rode out to the valley where it all started. He stopped at the spot where he found Ahioka, the dirt still stained faint with her blood. He sat there a long time, the wind whispering around him. He thought of Ahioka, of Kohana, of the 100 warriors who chose peace over war. He thought of the townsfolk, their fear, their shame, their slow change. Jack was not a hero, not in his own eyes. He was just a man who could not walk away. Years passed, and a young boy from town, inspired by the tales, carved a wooden marker at the valley spot, etching Jack's name beside an arrow symbol. Townsfolk visited sometimes, leaving flowers, their heads bowed in quiet respect, while Jack watched from afar, his cough gone, his limp eased. On a quiet spring day, a lone Apache rider returned, his horse laden with woven blankets, his face weathered but calm. He dismounted at the town's edge, seeking Jack, and handed him a small, carved stone, etched with a horse and an arrow crossed together. The rider said nothing, only clasped Jack's shoulder firmly, then rode away, leaving the townsfolk whispering in awe, their hands empty of weapons, their eyes on the horizon. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter.